20 years. That's how long it's been since I've heard my father's voice. And talking to him and telling him that I love him almost didn't happen on November 9th, 2002. Because I almost made a choice not to pick up the phone. I don't know why. I'm not really clear. I've asked myself that question many times. What could possibly be too busy than hearing I love you from somebody that I love back? And the only answer I really come up with is that I have time, but nothing could be further from the truth. Because if one thing is never promised, it's tomorrow and time. But in the moment, we don't think about those things, do we? I certainly didn't in that moment. You see, I was doing a telethon. I was on air, and it was a long day. And in that moment, when we went to commercial break, in some amazing way, my father just happened to call. And I don't know how he would have known that. He lived thousands of miles away. But he called in that moment when that commercial happened. And still, I wasn't running to the phone. But here's the thing. I had a friend who did. You see, that day I had a friend who was visiting me in the studio audience, and he was holding on to my phone. And he saw it ring, and he saw Daddy. And he said, "Your dad's on the phone." And he was tapping at my phone, holding it to me in the distance. And I remember shooing him and going, "Oh, I'll call him later. Tell him I'll call him back." And he was pretty persistent. He said, "No, you have a couple minutes, Hil. Get the phone." And after a couple times of going back and forth and volleying that, "Get the phone, don't get the phone," I said, all right, I'll grab the phone. And you know what? I'm really glad I did. Because that was the last time I spoke to my father. We talked about what he was doing that evening. He asked me how it was going with the telethon, what my plans were. He shared that he was going to a Broadway show and going to see Thoroughly Modern Millie, which happened to be one of my favorites. And to this day, I still carry his unused ticket in my pocket. Just like Sutton Foster sang in the show herself, I always have this ticket in my pocket to do with as I choose. I choose to hold on to it. So my father never saw the show that day, but I like to think he had the best seat in the house. Because as much as we love to talk about Broadway and opera and music, that seat wasn't meant for him in that moment. But he had a nice dinner. He was walking to the theater, put his hand on the wall in Schubert Alley, right next to the Booth Theater. And before he even hit the floor, my father was gone. Massive heart attack. 1 o'clock in the morning, I got that call. And I knew, I was a kid that grew up with a father who was sick my whole life. I spent a lot of time doing my homework in hospital waiting rooms. And when you are a child of a disabled or father or parent with a illness, you get used to the possibility of him or her not being here tomorrow. But still, even with that knowledge, I didn't run to pick up that phone. It baffles me to this day. And what baffles me even more is that just a year prior, my dad cheated death. He was supposed to be in the North Tower of the World Trade Center on 9/11. And the other lawyer who was supposed to meet him there for a deposition called in sick for a 9 o'clock meeting. My father would have never made it out of that building. Being an amputee, being someone walking a little slower, that day would not have gone well for Stephen A. Russo. But I got him for another year. And still I didn't answer that phone. How easy it is to forget and take advantage of time. 20 years. I've had a lot of thoughts about how this day would go. That first year is always the hardest. The year of firsts, as you probably know if you've lost before. And then there's the 5-year anniversary and the 10-year anniversary and the 20-year anniversary where we are now. But I always thought at some point I would do something with this day. I don't know why 20, but I did. And for years I was saving my dad's shirts and clothing items that were important to him, special to him, things I knew. His Izod t-shirts, or lapel shirts rather, his tweed jacket with the little pads on the elbows, his Columbia University baseball jacket, and all of his fraternity t-shirts. I've got them all. And for a very long time, I thought, I'll make a quilt. And I'll give a piece of every quilt to every person in my family that meant something to my dad. My mom, my brother, my aunt, myself. And we'll all have a piece of my father. That never happened. The bag still sits in my mom's storage unit. Fortunately, a couple years ago, I did go through it, and I gave a number of things to the veterans, and just wanted to make sure that Stephen Russo was present somewhere else. Let somebody else to enjoy his things, because he did have beautiful things. And I kept his Columbia jacket, of course, and I kept his fraternity t-shirts that I sleep in to this day. And I thought, what else could I do? What can I do to celebrate my dad? Do I plant a tree? Do I get a plaque and put it on a park bench somewhere? I mean, the thoughts were going wild in my head. The quilt idea is not off the table either. It's just not something that's happened yet. But when you go through these thoughts of these losses and how to celebrate life and what I call Dad's Day, which is November 9th, a lot of times doing nothing is something. Just thinking of the person is something. And I remember having a conversation with my brother very recently where my brother David asked me, do you know anybody that's less than 20 years old that you just feel like you've known them forever? And I had to sit with that for a moment, and I thought, I don't know. I mean, there are some people in my life that are special to me under 20, but have I known them forever? Do I feel like I've known them before? And I could kind of tell where David was going with this, but I wasn't quite certain. But it led to a really long conversation on my ride back from Virginia on what could be present in my life that has been present before. Meaning, if my dad has come back, do I know the person he is today in someone else's soul? It's kind of a cool thought. And he said, pay attention to the people around you that are younger than 20, because at some point in your life, you might actually bump into Dad again. That's a comforting thought. And I'll definitely keep my eyes open. And then we moved on to the conversation of Mom. Because, as you know, it's easy to get frustrated and short sometimes with our parents as they get older. And my brother and I have this thing that we call LRP. So when those moments happen where Mom, can get on our nerves a little bit or frustrate us in some way, and we're complaining to the other, my brother David and I will simply say LRP. LRP. And what that simply means is last remaining parent. Because time is never promised. And we need to nurture these people and care for them like they cared for us. LRP. Yeah. It's so easy to get frustrated about the little things or roll our eyes at something that our parents say because we've heard it a million times before. But what I wouldn't give to hear those stories again that my dad would tell until tears came into his eyes. And I remember in 2003, just a year or so after my father passed, the movie Big Fish came out. And I really resonated with that movie because it was my father. The character in the movie, the father, how he always would tell these embellished stories for his son. And his son was so frustrated because he's like, just tell the truth. But the truth can be boring, right? To the eyes of a child. And I remember when I watched that movie, and there's a line in it that happens to be one of my favorite quotes. And it's, a man tells his stories so many times that he becomes his stories. They live on after him. And in that way, he becomes immortal. When people lose somebody close to them, I send them that quote because my dad, my big fish, is the perfect example of the storyteller. And that he was. And it makes me wonder where I get it from. There's no question. But I think about my dad, my big fish, and how I would give anything to hear those stories again. But when I hear the stories that he told, when we're sitting around the table, when we're laughing till tears come in our eyes, my family, friends, people who knew my father, I know that this quote is so true because he does become immortal through the stories that we tell from the stories he told. And that's special to me. And as much as that movie means something to me, and I cry every time I see it, it's just a reminder that those stories are part of the history of the people we lose. And that telling them over and over is our way of keeping their spirit alive. That is something I remind myself of all the time. So as I sit in this chair, which happens to be my dad's old chair, now covered, I think about so many of those moments with my dad. And after those years, that first year first, rather, I remember sitting in this very chair and getting really upset because I couldn't smell my dad on it anymore. And it's another reminder that the things that are important to us, the people, there are ways to keep them alive even if their scent is gone or their clothes are gone or even their house is gone or you can't hear their voice anymore like you used to at least. It's really to keep telling those stories. I really can't say that enough. So I think about this day, Dad's Day. I think about how it hits me every year. And I think that I'm willing to release this day and think about it every November 9th when it comes around, but honor it in a different way. Probably the way that Stephen A. Russo would want it honored. So as I get ready to close this conversation with you, I want to leave you with a few things to think about. First and foremost, pick up the phone, because tomorrow is never promised. Say I love you as often as possible. And remember that you're not too busy. How in the world can you think that you are too busy for more love to come into your life? Think about it. And if you're facing loss or grief or upset, be kind to those who reach out. It is really easy to push people away when we need support the most. Be open to that. And if someone says something to you because they don't know what to say when you're facing those moments, give them the space to say it. And be kind, because they're struggling with it as well. Listen for the signs. They come. If you've ever loved and lost, and you sit in the silence, the answers and the signs will be so clear to you. Whether it's the sound of a train in the distance, the wind in the trees, the laughter of a child, you'll get used to hearing those sounds over and over, right when you need it the most, right when you're asking the question. I know I do. I listen for the signs. The wind in the trees. That's my dad. And look into the eyes of the people whose paths you cross, because it might be someone familiar. I'm spending a little more time doing that lately, and I imagine I'll know when I cross that path, and I'm sure you will too. And of course, keep telling those stories. Keep laughing. Keep holding space to share, because that's how you keep them immortal. I left you with a lot today to think about. And in this moment, on this Dad's Day, and going forward, I know that I'll be listening to the wind. I'll be looking in many eyes. I'll be saying more I love yous. And I damn well will be picking up that phone. And I hope you will too. Be well. Be kind to your mind. And I'll see you on the flip.
I know that